The shouting started before I understood what it was about, and by the time I crossed the forecourt to see, 3 young men had already decided that an old man was being rude to them on purpose. I am Tobias Wren, 61 years old, and for 30 of those years I taught music to children who did not always want to learn it. I had come to the Aldermere Palace forecourt that morning for nothing more than the light. I like the way the early sun comes off the pale stone and the gilded rails, and I had a habit, in my retirement, of walking the long square before the crowds thickened. I was not looking for trouble. Trouble found the old man first, and then it found me, because I could not walk away from it. He was standing near the base of the south column, a small figure in a worn brown overcoat that was too heavy for the season. He had a flat cap pushed back off his forehead and a face like a folded map, all soft creases and weather. In one hand he held a paper bag with the top rolled down, the kind you carry bread home in. He was looking up at the palace front the way a man looks at a thing he has loved for a long time and does not expect to see many more times. He was not bothering anyone. He was simply standing, the way the very old stand, as if the standing itself were the errand. The 3 young men were behind him, and one of them had asked him to move. I did not hear the first request. I heard the second because the second was louder, and I heard the third because the third was a shout. I said, "Are you deaf? Move." The young man who said it was tall and pleased with himself, in the way that a certain kind of young man is pleased with himself in front of his friends. He had a phone in his hand, already turned sideways, already filming. The old man did not turn. He went on looking up at the stone, and the bag of bread hung from his hand, and the not turning was, to the young man with the phone, the most insulting thing in the world. That was the moment it all hinged on, though none of us knew it yet. The old man's stillness was read as contempt. The silence they mistook for rudeness was about to cost them more than they could imagine, though it would be a long 10 minutes before any of them learned why. "He's ignoring you," one of the others said and laughed. "Look at him, just blanking you, some people." He said it the way people say things they want to be overheard saying, performing the offense, feeding it. I should tell you about the guard now because he is the center of this, though he had not yet moved a muscle. He stood at the foot of the column on a low stone step, in the full ceremonial dress of the king's guard, the red wool tunic buttoned to the throat, the tall black bearskin, the white gloves, the rifle held just so, the medals a small bright row on his chest. He was perhaps 15 feet from the old man, and he was facing out across the square, eyes forward, perfectly still. I had walked past such men 100 times and thought of them, I am ashamed to say, as part of the architecture, a thing that stood. I did not know his name then. I learned it later, Corporal Edrin Voss. But on that morning he was, to me, exactly what the young men thought the old man was being, a figure that would not respond. "Mate," the tall one had given up on the old man for a moment and turned his phone on the guard instead. "Mate, this old boy's blocking the shot. Tell him to shift." He waved a hand in front of the guard's face, 2 feet from his nose. The guard did not blink. The young men found this hilarious. "It's like a museum," one said. "Statues everywhere." And then they went back to the old man, because the old man could at least, in theory, be made to react, and a reaction was what they were hunting. I want to be honest about myself here. I'm not a brave man. I'm a retired music teacher with a bad knee and a horror of scenes. My first instinct when the tall one put his hand on the old man's shoulder and turned him bodily around was to look for someone else to deal with it. I looked, in fact, straight at the guard, the way you look at the one adult in a room of misbehaving children. And I thought, he won't do anything. He can't. That's the whole point of him. I was wrong about that, but not in the way I expected. The old man turned around against his will, blinked at the 3 faces in front of him with an expression I will not forget. It was not contempt. It was not even fear, not at first. It was bewilderment, the open, undefended bewilderment of a man who has just been spun around and cannot understand why the world is suddenly angry at him. His mouth moved. He said something. And what he said made the young men laugh harder, because it came out too loud and oddly shaped. The words of a man who has not heard his own voice clearly in a very long time. "What is wrong with you?" the tall one said, leaning in, grinning for the camera. Say it again. Go on." The old man's bag of bread had slipped. It hit the cobbles and a roll came loose and went rolling, and he stooped after it the way the old stooped slowly, with a hand on his own knee. And one of the young men nudged it further with his shoe lightly, just enough to keep it out of reach, and they laughed at that too. And I stood there, 61 years old, and did nothing, and I will carry that for the rest of my life, the 3 or 4 seconds in which I did nothing. I did not have to carry it long. The guard moved. I have tried many times since to describe how he moved, because it was not like a man breaking and running. It was not dramatic. It was the most controlled thing I have ever seen a human body do. He did not shout, did not raise his rifle, did not so much as change the expression on his face. He simply came down off the low step, 3 paces, in the unhurried, measured tread of a man on parade, and the very ordinariness of it, the discipline of it, was what made everyone stop. The young men felt him before they saw him. You feel a thing that size and that certain coming toward you the way you feel weather change. They turned, and the guard stopped, exactly between them and the old man, and stood. He did not say a word. He did not have to. The whole shape of the thing had changed. A second ago there had been an old man and 3 young men and a rolling loaf and a phone. Now there was a wall in a red coat, and the wall was between them and the thing they had been doing, and the wall was looking at them. The tall one tried to laugh it off. All right. We were only messing. He started it, he was being rude, blanking us." The guard turned his head. Just his head, a slow quarter turn toward the old man. And then I watched the most extraordinary thing. The guard, who had not bent a rule, who had given nothing of himself to the 3 of them, looked down at the old man with a different face entirely, and he raised one white-gloved hand slowly and touched his own ear, and then opened his palm flat and tilted it, the small universal question, "Can you hear me?" The old man's whole body changed. The bewilderment broke, and underneath it was something so naked it was hard to watch, relief. Someone had asked the right question. The old man shook his head once and lifted his own hand and tapped his ear and made a small, helpless, cutting motion across the air. "Nothing. I hear nothing." The forecourt went quiet, not because anyone announced it. The crowd that had gathered to watch the fun, and a crowd had gathered, a dozen, then 20, phones up, felt the floor drop out of the joke all at once. The old man was deaf. He had not been ignoring anyone. He had never heard a single word they shouted at him. He had been standing in his too warm coat, looking up at a building he loved, in a silence so complete that the angry faces appearing in front of him must have seemed to come from nowhere at all. And the worst of it, the thing that made a young woman near me put her hand over her mouth, was that you could see the old man putting it together too. You could see him realize slowly, with the loaf still on the cobbles between his feet, what the laughing had been about, that they had thought he was being cruel to them, that a deaf old man who had likely spent years being shouted at by impatient strangers had just been shouted at again and filmed and mocked for the crime of not hearing. I thought he might weep. I would not have blamed him. Instead, he did something that undid me. He bent, with the guard's gloved hand hovering near his elbow now, not gripping, just there, ready, and he picked up his own loaf off the stones and brushed it on his sleeve, and put it back in the bag and rolled the top down and straightened, and looked at the 3 young men with a dignity that made them look very small. He was not going to give them his tears. He had clearly decided that a long time ago, about a lot of people. But the guard was not finished. And what he did next is the reason I am telling you any of this at all. The guard turned back to the 3 young men, and for the first time he spoke. His voice was low and level and carried no further than it had to. "He is a deaf man," he said. "He did not hear you. He has never heard you. You have been shouting at a man who cannot hear, and you have been filming it." A pause, and the next part was quieter still, which made it land harder. "Put the phone down." The tall one's grin had gone watery. He looked around for his friends to back him, and his friends had quietly become very interested in the cobbles. "I didn't know," he said. "How was I supposed to know he was?" "You asked him 3 times to move," the guard said. "When he did not move, you turned him around with your hands. A man who does not answer you might be rude. He might also be deaf or lost or afraid or simply old and slow and looking at a thing he loves. You decided it was rudeness because rudeness was the answer that let you do what you wanted to do. That was the choice you made. It was the wrong one." He did not say it cruelly. That was what made it terrible for them. There was no triumph in it, no heat. He said it the way a man states the weather, and somehow that was worse than any shout, because you cannot argue with a man who is not angry. He is simply right, and you are simply standing in it. "Now," the guard said, "you are going to do 3 things." And the young men, who had come to the forecourt that morning as kings of their own small kingdom, stood and listened to the wall in the red coat tell them what they were going to do, and they did not protest, because there was nowhere left to stand that was not under his gaze. I should explain something about the rules of his post, because I learned it later and it matters. A king's guard on ceremonial duty is not supposed to do any of this. He is meant to hold his ground, eyes forward, silent, and let the situation be handled by the police constables and the gate sergeants whose job it is. To step down off the post to speak, to interpose himself, that is a serious thing. There is a standing order against it, written precisely so that a guard cannot be baited into a brawl by every fool with a phone. The discipline is the silence. The silence is the whole point of him. So when Corporal Voss came down off that step, he was not, as I had lazily assumed, doing the easy thing. He was doing the hard thing. He was spending something. He had judged, in the half-second it took him to read the old man's face, that this was the one moment the silence had to end, and he had decided to wear whatever came of it. I did not understand that yet, standing in the crowd. I only understood it later, when I learned what it cost him by the afternoon. At the time I only knew that the most disciplined man on the square had broken his own first rule, and had done it not for a shout in his own face. He had taken those all morning, I was told, the wave in front of his nose, the statue, the museum jokes, but for a stranger who could not even ask for help. I have since heard, from people who know the forecourt better than I do, that Corporal Voss had a reputation among the gate staff long before that morning. Not a loud reputation. The opposite. He was the one, they said, who noticed things. A guard stands his post for hours and the great river of visitors flows past him, 10,000 faces in a morning, laughing, photographing, paying him no more mind than they pay the railings. Most men let it wash over them. That is how you survive the hours. But Voss watched it. And in all that flow he had trained himself over the years to catch on the few faces that did not fit the current. The woman who had stopped smiling and was scanning the crowd for a child no longer beside her. The man pressing a hand to his chest who needed not the palace but a bench and an ambulance. The old one standing too long and too still in front of a thing. The way a person stands when they are saying goodbye to it. The gate sergeant told me later that Voss had quietly flagged more lost children and more quiet medical emergencies in a year than the rest of the watch put together, all without ever leaving his post improperly, just a word to the runner, a tip of the chin, a thing seen and passed on. He was a sentinel in the oldest sense of the word, not a man who merely stood, but a man who kept watch. The standing was only the posture. The watching was the work. So when he came down off the step for Mr. Halloran, it was not a sudden thing at all. It was the last and largest act of a long habit of noticing the people the world flows past. He had simply seen, faster than any of us, what the rest of us were too busy being entertained to see. The 3 things were these. First, the guard said, you will pick up what you knocked from his hand. There was a second roll out on the cobbles still, that they had nudged away. The tall one went and got it, and his face as he stooped for it in front of 40 people was a thing I would not wish on a son of mine, but it was a face he had earned. He brought it back and held it out, not knowing how to give it to a man who could not hear. The guard nodded at him once and tipped his own chin toward the old man's bag, and the young man understood and held the roll out where the old man could see it, and the old man took it and put it away and gave the young man a small, grave nod. Not forgiveness, acknowledgement. The young man's eyes were wet now too. Good, I thought, and was ashamed of thinking it and thought it anyway. Second, the guard said, you will delete what you filmed. The phone came up, the thumb moved, and the guard watched the screen until the deed was done, and the tall one turned the dark screen toward him to prove it. I have wondered since whether it was truly gone or only hidden, but I watched the young man's hands shake while he did it, and I think, for that one morning at least, the shame was real. Third, the guard said, and here his voice changed just slightly into something I can only call instruction rather than command, you will remember this. Not the way I am making you feel right now. That will fade by lunch. That is only your pride smarting. You will remember the man. You will remember that he could not hear you, and that you decided that was an insult to you instead of a hardship to him. The next time the world does not answer you the way you want, you will think of him standing here in his coat, and you will ask a different question first. Do you understand me? Yes, the tall one said. He could barely get it out. Then go, the guard said. And they went. They did not swagger. They walked out of that forecourt like men leaving a church, and the crowd opened to let them through and closed again behind them, and no one said a word to them, which was its own kind of sentence. And then it was just the old man, and the guard, and 40 strangers who did not know what to do with the size of what they had just watched. The guard turned back to the old man. And now, with the young men gone, the whole register of him changed again. The wall came down, and what was underneath it was gentleness. He did not tower over the old man. He did something I have thought about 100 times since. He came down to him. He bent at the knee, slowly, in that immaculate red coat with everyone watching, and brought his face level with the old man's, so that the old man would not have to crane up at a great stern figure, but could simply look across at another man's eyes. The old man's mouth worked. He wanted to say something and could not find the shape of it, the way the long-deaf sometimes cannot trust their own loudness. The guard understood. He held up one finger, wait, and with his white-gloved hands he began, slowly and a little clumsily but with great care, to sign. I did not know then what he was signing. I am not a signing man. But I knew what it meant to watch a king's guard, the very emblem of a thing that does not bend, kneel on the stone of the forecourt and shape words with his hands for a deaf old stranger, and I was not the only one. The young woman beside me was crying openly now and not bothering to hide it. An older gentleman behind me took off his hat. We did not know we were going to do these things. The morning had simply asked them of us. The old man's face, watching the guard's hands, went through something extraordinary. First the confusion, because the signs were slow and not perfect. Then comprehension dawning. Then, and this is the part I cannot tell without my own voice going, then a smile, a real one, breaking across that folded map face like sun coming over a hill, because someone in the uniform of the thing he had come to love had knelt down on the cold stone and spoken to him in his own silent language, and asked him, I would learn, the simplest question in the world. The guard had asked him his name. The old man's hands answered, slowly, the guard reading them. And then the guard did a thing that told me he had truly meant the kneeling. He turned to the crowd, still down on his knee, and said, in that same level voice, his name is Mr. Halloran. He would like you all to know that he is not deaf from birth. He lost it in his 50s in the works, and he came here today because he wanted to see the front of the palace one more time before his eyes go too. A pause. He is going blind. That is why he was standing so still and looking so long. He was looking while he still can. I have stood in a great many quiet rooms in my life. Concert halls between movements, churches at the end of a service, the bedside of my own father at the last. I have never heard a quiet like the one that fell on that forecourt. 100 people, and not a sound from any of them, and the gilded rails catching the early light, and an old man named Halloran standing in his too heavy coat with a bag of bread, who had been mocked 5 minutes ago for ignoring a stranger, and who was here on what might be one of the last clear mornings of his sight, looking at a building he loved. The shame of the crowd was a physical thing. I felt it in myself. We had all, at the start, leaned in a little to watch the fun. We had all been, for the first half-minute, a part of the audience the three young men were performing for. The guard had not only stopped them, he had held a mirror up to every one of us and made us look at what we had been about to enjoy. But the guard was not in the business of shame. He was in the business of the next right thing, and he was already doing it. He rose, that slow, controlled rise again, the discipline of the body that never wastes a movement, and he looked across the crowd until he found a face I had not noticed. A younger guardsman, off to the side near the gate, a runner, the one who carries messages and fetches the sergeant. The corporal lifted two gloved fingers, and the runner came at the double. They spoke, low and fast, the corporal's eyes never quite leaving the old man, and the runner went off through the gate at a pace that was not quite a run but wanted to be. I learned afterward what he had sent for, and it was not the police. He had sent for two things. He had sent for the duty officer, because by the book he owed a report the moment he stepped off his post, and Corporal Voss was not the kind of man who hides a thing he has chosen to do. And he had sent for someone from the palace's own visitor office who, it turned out, signed. A young woman named Pell, who came out a few minutes later at a brisk walk, took one look at the situation, and crouched straight down beside Mr. Halloran, as if she had been waiting all her life to be useful in exactly this way. What happened next took perhaps 20 minutes, and it was the gentlest 20 minutes I have ever watched in a public place. Pell signed to Mr. Halloran, fast and fluent where the corporal had been slow and careful, and the old man's hands flew back, and his whole face opened up. He had not had a real conversation, I think, in a long time. You could see it in how greedily he answered, how much there was stored up behind that silence with nowhere to go. The corporal stood his post again. He had gone back to it, quietly, the moment Pell arrived, because the post still mattered, and a thing being handled is a thing you may return your discipline to. But he stood it now turned just slightly, so that the old man was inside the edge of his attention, and I understood that this was as far as he would step from the line of his duty and not 1 inch further, and that the not stepping further was its own kind of devotion. Pell told us, relaying it, what the old man's morning had been. He had taken 2 buses to come here. He lived alone. His wife was 9 years gone. He had worked 40 years in a place full of machines that took his hearing a decibel at a time, until one day it was simply gone, and he had never quite got the trick of asking for help, because asking meant explaining, and explaining meant standing in front of an impatient stranger making them wait, and he had decided, somewhere along the way, that it was easier to be thought rude than to be a burden. He had come to the palace because his late wife had loved it, and because the eye doctor had told him, gently, the week before, that he should go and look at the things he wanted to remember while the looking was still good. He had come to look at the palace one more time, and 3 young men had turned that morning into a thing he would have to forgive. But here is what the guard had done. By kneeling, by signing, by spending his own discipline on a stranger, he had reached into that morning and changed what it would be remembered as. Because of him, Mr. Halloran would not carry away the memory of being mocked. He would carry away the memory of a man in a red coat who knelt on cold stone to ask his name. The guard had not been able to give the old man back his hearing or save his eyes. But he had been able to decide which moment the day belonged to, and he had decided it would belong to dignity. The duty officer came. I had braced for trouble. I had read enough to know the corporal had broken protocol, and the part of me that had spent 30 years in institutions knew how institutions can treat a man who steps out of line, even for the best reason in the world. The officer was a tall woman, Major Sten, very correct, and she listened to the corporal's quiet report standing at the foot of the column with her hands behind her back, and she looked at the old man, and she looked at the crowd, and she looked for a long moment at the empty stretch of cobbles where the three young men had stood. Then she said something to the corporal that I was close enough to hear, and that I have kept. "You left your post." "I did, ma'am," said Corporal Voss. He did not make excuses. He did not say the old man needed him, or the young men were cruel, or the crowd was watching. He said the plain fact and stood by it. I think he was prepared to be disciplined for it. I think he had been prepared for that from the moment he came down off the step, and had decided the old man was worth it, and that was the whole measure of the man. The major was quiet for a moment. "Tell me why," she said. And the corporal told her, not defending, just reporting, that a man was being abused on the forecourt and could not call for help because he could not hear, that the constables were at the far gate and would not have reached him for a minute or more, that in that minute the thing would have gotten worse and been filmed and put out into the world, and a deaf old man on perhaps his last good morning would have been made a spectacle for strangers' amusement, that he, Voss, had judged that the standing order existed to keep a guard from being baited into a fight over his own pride, and that this was not his pride. This was a man who could not speak for himself. And so he had decided the order did not cover it, and if he was wrong about that, he would take the consequence. The major listened to all of it. Then she did a thing I did not expect. She turned to the old man, and though she did not sign, she took off her cap and she inclined her head to him, a small, formal, deliberate bow, officer to guest, the palace to the man it is meant to serve. And then she turned back to the corporal. "The order," she said, "exists to protect the dignity of the post. You have not damaged the dignity of the post." She paused. "You may have just shown a great many people watching exactly what it is for." She put her cap back on. "Return to your duty, Corporal. I'll note it as a correct exercise of judgment. There will be no fault on your record." And then more quietly, just to him, "Well done." I do not think the crowd was meant to hear that last part. But the crowd had gone so silent that we heard it anyway, and something went through us all, not a cheer. It was not a cheering kind of morning, but a kind of collective exhale, a release of the fear we had all been holding for the man who had done the right thing, that the doing of it would cost him. It did not cost him. That mattered to me more than I can say. While the major and the corporal had spoken, the rest of the forecourt had not stood idle, and this is a part of the morning I am glad to be able to tell. A crowd that has been shamed can do one of two things. It can scatter, each person hurrying off to be alone with the small, ugly fact that they had leaned in to watch a cruelty before it turned. Or it can do the harder thing, which is to stay and try in some clumsy way to set right the share of the morning that belonged to it. To my surprise, and it has stayed with me as a kind of faith in people, the forecourt chose the second thing. It began with the young woman who had wept. She came forward, hesitant, and crouched near Pell and asked through her whether she might say something to Mr. Halloran. Pell signed it across, and the old man nodded, and the young woman said, looking at his eyes, not at Pell, which was the right thing, and I do not know how she knew to do it, "I'm sorry. I watched. At the start I watched and I didn't help. I'm ashamed of that. I'm glad you're all right." Pell's hands moved, and the old man watched them, and then he reached out and patted the young woman's hand twice, gently, the way you reassure someone who has confessed a thing that frightened them more than it frightened you. She went away looking lighter than she had come. Then others came. An older couple, a man in a delivery uniform who had stopped his rounds to watch and now could not seem to leave. A mother with a small daughter who wanted, the mother explained, for her girl to meet the kind man and the brave guard, so that this, the kneeling, the patience, the asking, would be the thing the child remembered about a king's guard, and not the jokes she had heard the big boys make. The corporal, back at his post by then, could not break it again to speak to her, but he looked down at the little girl from beneath the bearskin and gave her the smallest, gravest nod, and she will, I think, remember that nod for a very long time. I hope she does. I hope she tells it badly to her own children one day, and they roll their eyes and she tells it anyway. This is what the corporal had done, beyond the rescue of one old man. He had turned a crowd that was about to become an audience for cruelty into a small gathering of people trying to be decent. He had not lectured us into it. He had simply done the decent thing first, in front of all of us at cost to himself. And decency, it turns out, is catching when someone is brave enough to go first. I had spent 30 years trying to teach that to children with sheet music. He taught it to 100 strangers in 10 minutes without saying it aloud at all. What happened to the 3 young men is a smaller story, but I will tell it because people always want to know. There was no arrest. The corporal had not asked for one, and the old man, when Pell put the question to him, shook his head firmly. He did not want the boys punished by the law. They are young and they were stupid, Pell relayed, the old man's hands moving as she spoke. Stupid is not the same as wicked. I have been young and stupid. Let them carry it. Carrying it is enough. There is a forgiveness in some old men that humbles you, and I felt humbled because I had wanted them punished and the man they had wronged did not. But the world is a smaller place than the young think, and the world has its own way of settling accounts that has nothing to do with the law. Someone in that crowd, it turned out not me, I had no phone worth the name, had filmed the second half of it. Not the mocking the tall one had deleted. What was filmed and what went out across the country in the days that followed was the kneeling. The guard in his red coat coming down onto the cold stone. The white gloves shaping slow words. The old man's face breaking into that sunrise smile. The major taking off her cap and bowing her head. That was the morning the country saw, and the 3 young men were not in it at all, except as 3 pairs of shoes walking out of the frame, and I have always thought there was a justice in that more exact than any court could manage. They had wanted to be the stars of a video. They had succeeded only in being the reason a better one existed, and then in being edited out of it. The world remembered the kneeling. It did not remember them. For young men who live to be seen, I cannot think of a fitter sentence than to be forgotten in the very story they had tried to author. I went home that day and I could not settle to anything. I kept seeing the kneeling. I am a man who spent his life trying to teach children that discipline and feeling are not enemies, that you practice your scales 10,000 times in cold rooms precisely so that one day, when the music matters, your hands are free to mean something. I had said it 100 ways to 100 children, and I am not sure I ever fully believed it until I watched a king's guard do exactly that on the forecourt. All those mornings of standing still. All that silence, all that training of the body to hold and hold and hold. Not so that he would feel nothing, so that when the one moment came that asked everything of him, he would have it ready, the judgment, the steadiness, the exact and unwasted movement, and could spend it all at once on an old man who could not even thank him out loud. That is what the discipline had been for. The stillness was never the point. The stillness was the practice. The kneeling was the music. I want to tell you what happened after, because it did not end on the forecourt, and the ending is the part I have come to treasure most. Mr. Halloran came back. Not the next week. It took longer than that, but a month or so on a bright morning, and I happened to be there because I had found myself returning to that square more often, the way you return to a place where you once saw something true. He came through the visitor's entrance this time, not the open forecourt, and he was not alone. Pell was with him, and so, walking just behind in the plain dark suit of an off-duty man rather than the red coat, was Corporal Voss. I almost did not know him out of uniform. He was younger than I had thought, and ordinary, the way the most extraordinary people are so often ordinary when you meet them on a Tuesday. He walked beside the old man at the old man's pace, which is to say slowly, and now and then he signed something and the old man signed back, and the corporal laughed, an actual laugh, head tipped, the sternness all gone. He had been learning, Pell told me. After that morning he had asked her to teach him, properly in his off hours, and he had been at it ever since, and he was, she said, terrible at it and getting better, and the old man delighted in correcting his clumsy hands the way, Only a teacher delights in a willing pupil. For that was the thing none of us had known on the forecourt, the thing that makes the whole story turn over in my chest when I think of it. The slow, careful, imperfect signing the corporal had done that first morning, kneeling in front of 40 strangers, shaping words with hands that plainly did not know the language well. He had taught himself. A little, in secret. Some months before, off-duty, from a book and a few videos, the way a careful man teaches himself a thing he thinks he might one day need. Because he stood his post day after day and he watched the people come, and among the thousands he had begun to notice the ones the others overlooked, the lost, the frightened, the ones who could not ask. And he had decided, quietly on his own time, with no one telling him to and no one ever likely to know, that he would learn enough of the silent language to say the most important things to the people who lived inside the silence, just in case the morning ever came. The morning had come, and he had been ready. I have thought a great deal about that since, about a man preparing with no audience and no reward in view for a kindness he might never be called upon to give. There is a word for that, and the word is not bravery, though it is close kin to it. The word is honor. Honor is not the grand gesture in front of the crowd. Honor is the long, unwitnessed labor that makes the grand gesture possible, the scales practiced in the cold room, the hands taught in secret, so that when the music finally matters, you are not caught empty. They walked the old man up to the front of the palace that bright morning, the corporal and the young woman, one on each side, and they stood with him a while and let him look. His eyes, Pell said, were worse now. The doctors had been right. The clear mornings were running out. But he had this one, and he had 2 friends in it, and he had a memory of this place that was no longer the memory of being shouted at by strangers. The corporal had reached back into that first cruel morning and replaced it, and now he was building over it, week by week, a thing the old man could keep. Before they left, Mr. Halloran turned and looked across the forecourt to where the guard on duty stood, a different guard now, a younger one, red coat, bearskin, eyes forward, perfectly still, exactly as the corporal had stood on the morning all this began. And the old man raised his hand. Not a wave. A salute, an old man's salute, stiff and not quite right, the salute of a man who had once, long ago, served in some small way himself, before the machines took his ears. He held it for a moment, facing the still figure on the step. And the guard on the step, who did not know him, who knew nothing of the story, who was simply a disciplined man holding his post on a bright morning. The guard brought his own white-gloved hand up, slowly, correctly, and returned it. He was not supposed to. It is not in the drill to salute a stranger from the post. But word travels in a regiment, and I have always believed that young man knew exactly who the old man with the failing eyes must be, and decided, as another had decided before him on those same stones, that this was the one moment the rule could bend. The silence they had all once mistaken for rudeness had been answered at the last by a silence that meant the opposite. 2 men who could not hear each other across a forecourt, speaking the only way that mattered, hand to hand, honor to honor. Mr. Halloran lowered his salute. He turned, and Pell took one arm and the corporal took the other, and the 3 of them walked back toward the gate slowly, at the old man's pace, into the bright morning he had come to keep. I stood and watched until they were through the gate and gone. I am 61 years old. I have seen orchestras bring a hall to its feet, and I have stood in cathedrals built to make a man feel small before God. I have never been more moved than I was by a guardsman on his knees on cold stone, asking a deaf old man his name. The whole machinery of that uniform, the discipline, the silence, the stillness, the iron refusal to react that I had once dismissed as so much architecture, I understand it now. It was never about not feeling. It was about being so completely the master of yourself that, on the one morning it mattered, you could give all of yourself away, in the exact and unwasted shape the moment required, to someone who could not even ask. They mistook his silence for rudeness, that first morning, and they were wrong. They had it backwards. The loudest thing on the forecourt that day was the man who never raised his voice at all.